Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn, and this is Traditional Woodworking by Hand. And as promised in episode 47, today we're going to be talking about saw filing. We've talked in the past about what makes a good saw. And we've also briefly touched on the fact that many saws are divided into two classes: saws for cutting across the wood, crosscut saws, and saws for cutting with the grain, known as rip saws. But I want to point out before we start today's episode that there are a lot of saws in the Western workshop that all end up needing to be filed the way that I'm going to show you in a minute. For example, we have here a frame saw. It has a narrow blade and it's particularly good for sawing big curves or large stretches of wood. Here's another saw that's similar to that, but you'll notice it has an even thinner blade, which is turnable, so that it is even better suited for sawing out round shapes, as opposed to what these panel saws do, which is to make straight cuts either with the grain or across the grain. In addition, there are what we call compass saws or keyhole saws, saws that by their very nature are very thin and which are also ideally suited for sawing curves. Perhaps more common to most of you are the common back saws, as they're called in America. In England, we would call this a tenon saw because it cuts a tenon. Tenon saws, or back saws, whatever you want to call them, are remarkable for the fact that by and large, the teeth that are cut in them are rip teeth, meaning that if they were on a panel saw, they'd be used for sawing with the grain. This is such a saw. This is an expensive contemporary saw made by Lee Nielsen, and it's a rip crosscut saw. This is a much older saw, as you can tell by the beautiful little lamb's tongue here on the fancy handle. This has got teeth cut on the crosscut. There are reasons for both of those, which we'll go into later. But I just want to point out how many saws there are that all need to be sharpened the way that I'm going to show you today. Here's one other relatively unusual saw, and this is called an inside start saw. And it's the saw that you use when you can't get to the end of the piece of work that you're sawing. If you'll want to saw a hole in a floor, for example, you start off with a curved piece until you've made a little slot. Then you can turn the saw around and then you can saw that way. All of these saws get filed to be either rip cut or cross cut. That's what we're going to talk about today. The easiest way to do that is to secure the blade in something called a saw vise. Now, this is a particularly old one. You just clamp it in the vise and you can put the blade of the saw that you want to sharpen in here. And it's best if you can put the blade down as close to the jaws as possible, and starting at one end. And then as you move along, you gradually release it and you bring the saw out. And what that does is to reduce the amount of flutter and scratching and screeching and everything else. But as I mentioned before, if you don't happen to have a saw vise, you can almost equally well secure the saw by taking two pieces of tapered wood and putting the saw between the two pieces of tapered wood, once again with the teeth close to the top of the tapered pieces, and put the tapered pieces in the vise. That will also secure the saw nicely for filing. Here we have a rip saw. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, the first thing that you do before filing a saw is to make sure that the teeth are all the same height, albeit with a slight crown, but we'll forget the crown for the moment. The traditional way is to use this odd little tool that once again is being made brand new, called a saw jointer. And it simply holds a flat file and it sits over the saw, and all you do is to drag it along all the teeth until you've produced a shiny spot on the top of every tooth. Now this may mean that some of the teeth are blunt, some of them come to a point, but at least you know by virtue of the shiny spot that all the teeth are the same height. As I also said before, if you don't have one of these, don't despair. It's very easy to take a flat file, saw a slot in a square piece of wood, and by holding the face of the wood against the side of the saw, you can achieve exactly the same thing. You can go the length of the saw and you can produce a shiny spot on the top of every saw. Now we get to the meat of the matter, the actual filing. The first thing is to choose a file, a three-sided file, all of which angles are 60 degrees, that is the right size for this. This is maybe a little too big. As you can see, there's a lot of the file is sticking up. So we go to a smaller file. And you can place the file in between the first two teeth, and all you have to do is to file backwards and forwards until you remove half the shiny spot. Now, the thing to remember is that the more vertical the edge of the tooth that goes into the wood is, the faster the saw will cut, but the rougher the cut it will get. So if I were to place the file in like this, with the top of it being perfectly vertical, you'll see that both sides are now at exactly 45 degrees, well, 60 degrees. They're both equal. If I wanted this, it's a fairly coarse rip saw that I want to do for rough work, and I want it to work a little faster, I would tilt this just a little bit. So now you can see that the top of the file is no longer horizontal. And I need to maintain that angle throughout the length of the saw. So the process is having the saw in the saw vise as close to the jaws as possible to reduce screeching and shuttering. I put this in, put it at the right angle, and simply file across until I've removed half the shiny spot of whatever I achieved before. And I do that the entire length of the saw. That's all there is to filing a crosscut saw. Now, we didn't actually joint this, so you don't actually see the shiny spots, but what I'm talking about is how you actually file. That's all you have to do to file a rip saw. Every other tooth, the entire length of the saw. When you get to the end of the vise, you loosen the vise and you bring the saw back so that the end of the saw is now supported. If I can find the handle, just to reduce chatter. And you continue filing every other tooth until you've removed half the shiny spot. When you've done that, you come back to the beginning, repositioning the saw in the vise, and now you put the file at the same angle in the next tooth, and you remove the other shiny spot. What could be simpler? So the basic thing to remember is that to file the teeth of a rip saw, you hold the file horizontal and you file from side to side, And depending on how coarse or how fine a cut you want, you tilt the blade. Remember, the more that the file is tilted, the steeper the leading edge will be, and the quicker the saw will cut, but the rougher the cut will be. Now let's move on to something a little more complicated, and we'll look at how you file the crosscut saw. Here now is a crosscut saw. And the difference between filing the teeth on a crosscut saw from a rip saw is that you don't file straight across, producing a lot of little chisel-shaped edges, but you file at an angle so that the leading edge of each tooth is more like a chisel that cuts into the wood. But it's every other tooth that is filed one way, and then the intervening teeth are filed the other way. The same thing that I mentioned before about the angle at which you hold the file also holds true here. But in general, we typically want a smoother cut for crosscut saws. So I'm going to hold this a little more perfectly horizontal. And I'm going to start at this tooth here, and you'll notice that instead of holding the file horizontal or perpendicular to the blade so that I get a lot of chisels, I'm holding it this way so that it cuts like a lot of little knives. And all I do is once again file until I've removed half the shiny spot of that particular tooth. Then I miss a tooth and go to the next tooth and do the same thing. And I file until I've removed half the shiny spot of that tooth. I proceed the entire length of the blade, moving the blade in the saw vise so that I don't get any chatter when I'm down here. And then I can either turn the saw around, or, as I generally prefer, is simply to put the file in my other hand, and holding it at the same angle, I now file off half the shiny spot of the alternate teeth. That's all there is to filing a crosscut saw. And the same thing is true whether it's a crosscut saw or a rip saw for all these other saws. I don't think that saw filing or saw sharpening is a particularly difficult thing. In the old days, before everybody had a circular saw, a lot of retired woodworkers would set up shop as saw filers. But there's absolutely no reason why you can't provide yourself with a triangular file that's the appropriate size for the particular teeth that you want to get, whether it's a really big one, if you've got like a 6-point rip cut saw, or whether it's a really tiny one that you might want to use for, say, something like a fine tooth back saw. That's really all there is to filing the teeth of a saw. You go across if it's a rip cut, you go at an angle if it's a cross cut. I hope you like that. Don't forget, hit the subscribe button. Feel free to ask me questions, and in future episodes we'll demonstrate some of the trickier moves that you can make with these saws once you've got them all nicely sharpened. Thank you.